Hello, my name is Philip Kramer. I'm one of the organisers of the Morpeth Book Festival 2025. This is the third Morpeth Book Festival, which is going to take place on the 22nd and 23rd of March of this year. I'm conducting a number of interviews with some of those who are speaking at the festival, and I am very grateful to have with me today one of our authors, Guy Morpuss, King's Counsel. Guy was brought up in South Africa. He actually emanates from the West Country, but he was brought up in, or Midlands, but he was brought up in South Africa. But he came over here to practice in the law, 30 years as a commercial lawyer, ending up as King's Counsel, appearing in a lot of leading commercial cases. And if you do the research, you'll find a lot of juniors who will put on their CV, I was led by Guy Morpuss in this important case. He left that after 30 years and became a highly acclaimed novelist, having written crime thrillers, 2 already in print, Five Minds and Black Lake Manor, and his most recent novel, A Trial in 3 Acts, is to be published this year. I know it's highly acclaimed, even though I haven't read it, because no less than Janice Hallett, herself a Crime Writers Association award winner, has said it's her future book of the year, as I'm told has B.A. Paris, who's also appearing at our festival. So, Guy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time. I'm doing a bit of research, obviously, before we had this talk. And something that struck me is a point you made in an article you wrote for Counsel magazine was how you were inspired to go into the law by literature, by books about the law. And I'd like you just to give us a flavour of what you were looking at and what you found interesting there.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm very much looking forward to the festival. My father was the source of my reading, I think, when I was younger, and he was a lawyer, and he had on his shelves a lot of thrillers, Alistair MacLean, Desmond Bagley, that sort of era of thriller, but also Arthur Conan Doyle, a lot of Perry Mason, quite a lot of Rumpole. And so I grew up voraciously reading whatever I could get off his bookshelves that he'd let me read. And it was a real mix of thrillers and law. And he was also very much into films about law. So Witness for the Prosecution with Charles Laughton is one of the earliest films I can remember watching. I remember thinking how brilliant it was. And how brilliant the barrister was, when actually you realise what's happening is he's the one being played all along by Marlene Dietrich. But it was that actually inspired me to decide I wanted to be a barrister. So I got a lot out of reading and learning about law and learning, I think, how to tell a story, which I think became useful later on when I was a lawyer.
I see. After you saw what Marlene Dietrich managed, you never resorted to having a monocle to try and cross-examine, to glare the opposition. You said in this article that it's not sufficient as a lawyer simply to deny the other side's case. What you need to do is produce a counter-narrative, something for the judge to decide between. And is there a connection there between being the storyteller in court, so to speak, and becoming the storyteller many years later in your novels?
Absolutely. I think the older you get as a trial lawyer, the more you realise that cases have very, very little to do with the law. And what you've got to do to win a case is to persuade the judge that your client is the good guy and the other side is the bad guy, or slightly less good, because you want the judge to start with the view that they want to find in favour of your client. And you do that not by lecturing them about some minutiae of the Trademarks Act or something. You do that by telling them a nice story, telling them how wonderful your client is and how badly they were treated. And then they start with the right mindset, because most cases that go to court, the law isn't 100% clear. And so if you can tell a nice story to the judge, you're more likely to win. And I used to describe it to my juniors as essentially a performance. It's a one-off play that you're performing for an audience of one, in the hope that you can tell a better story than the other side do. And surprisingly, not a lot of lawyers, or a lot of lawyers don't realise that. And they lose cases by going on about the law rather than telling the judge why they ought to win.
Yeah. Did you find you were good at identifying what the best counter narrative was? Because clients often have several stories they wish to run.
Yes, because what you've got to do is tell a very simple story. The more complicated you make it and the more points you throw towards the judge, the more likely your good points get lost in the bad ones. And so most judges will say, look, give me your best point first. If you can't persuade me of that, don't bother. And so what you've got to do at a very early stage is identify what is your case that you're going to sell to the judge. And you either win or lose on that, essentially. It's very rare that you win or lose on your 10th point.
Yeah. What I like about this is we're turning from an interview about novel writing to an instruction manual or instruction video about advocacy, I think now. But I'll steer this away. So how did that feed into your novel writing? Do you think, well, I'm pretty good at telling a story in court, so that'll carry over to the public in novel writing?
Well, I hope so. What I learned over the years was how to tell a story in as short a way as possible, which it seems to me for crime writing particularly is important. You don't want the sort of Lord of the Rings approach of 20 pages about, describing the background and the scene and the characters. Crime readers expect you to get into the story very fast. They ideally want a murder on page one, and then they want to see it moving on. And so I think the one thing you do learn as a lawyer as well is brevity, that judges are tired, they're bored, they've got a lot of cases, get to the point as quickly as possible. And so although there's a balance, you want some description, you need to know what the characters are. In a crime story, you want to keep it moving at a fast pace. And if you don't do that, crime readers will tend to have less patience, perhaps, than those who are used to reading literary novels or long fantasy novels where they might be a bit more forgiving. So I think that essence of storytelling has to carry over into your books, and luckily it seems to have.
Although I guess the distinction is it's not a great idea to keep the judge waiting until page 322 to find out what the denouement is. So I suppose you've had to adjust for that in order to keep up the dramatic tension. I'm going to ask you about why crime. Obviously, you did commercial law. You could have created a case book of stories loosely based upon your practice. Why did you do crime, and particularly murder as a crime?
I think a couple of reasons. One is that's what always interested me when I read stories. As I said, sort of Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, the thrillers I used to read, they were all crime thrillers, fast moving. That's the sort of story I like. And I think you've got to write what you would want to read, because otherwise it's very difficult. But there's also the fact that I don't actually think most of my cases would make a very interesting story. 90% of what goes on in court is pretty dull, even in criminal murder cases. There's a lot of argument about, the law, evidence when the jury keeps getting sent out. I had two cases where the judge actually fell asleep in the course of my submissions, and that's someone who's paid to sit there and listen to me. So if I'd simply set out even, my most interesting cases when I was doing, drug-taking cyclists or acting for Liverpool Football Club or whatever, it wouldn't have made a great story. Whereas crime has inherent within it, and particularly murder, high stakes, conflict, risk, the threat to the protagonists that they're going to get murdered. So it sort of sets you up. I think you're starting off at a bit of a gallop rather than starting off with something that could come across as a bit mundane.
Yeah, I was wondering if also crime rather appeals to sort of a visceral feeling that that's the one thing we're frightened of, murder, because it's finished. You can live through a push payment fraud or having a house burned down, but murder is, in a sense, the most frightening crime if it happens to us or anybody else we know.
Yes, I think absolutely. That's why it has, I think, the high stakes already built in. I should add also the other reason I think I did crime is, frankly, after 30 years, I was a bit tired of commercial law, and there's a reason that my first two books have nothing to do with law in them. I've come back to it after 4 years after I retired from law because I'm now actually slightly missing the cut and thrust of litigation, and so my third book is very much a legal thriller, and I've quite enjoyed it. But there was a point when I stopped doing law where I just thought I wanted to do something completely different. And Five Minds was an escape from law for doing something that I hadn't been doing for 30 years.
Yeah, and how do you, just reading your most recent current novel, set in Vancouver. So how can you be faithful to setting something in Vancouver? I know you've lived in South Africa, you've lived in this country. I think you have an interest in Vancouver, but how can you make that authentic?
Well, I had just been to Vancouver Island, which was part of the inspiration for it, and I would struggle, I think, to write somewhere I hadn't been at all. But there's an amazing atmosphere to Vancouver Island, particularly the west coast, where there's all these shipwrecks and the mist rolls in the morning, and it starts again. It starts you off with a wonderful scene which feels different, feels far from our normal experiences, and there's a lot of sort of background to it that you can draw on. But as I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been there, and I went there probably 6 months before I wrote the novel, and it just seemed to me a wonderful setting for it.
Yeah. So when you're planning your novels, did you have a plan as to roughly what the novel was going about, and then look for a location, or did you find the location and say this inspires me to write this particular novel?
No, I had the idea first. For both of the first two, I had a sort of germ of an idea, and then I built it out from that. But I'm not great at planning. I tend to write and then rewrite and then rewrite. Then it goes to my editor, and she tells me it doesn't work, and I need to rewrite it again. So I got a bit better for the third book with planning, and I did actually do a sort of 20-page outline. But that was largely because my editor, after I'd written 80,000 words of the novel, said to me, "This doesn't work, you need to start again." And I thought, well, I'll actually flesh it out this time to avoid all the waste of energy.
Uh, Another matter I read about in this article in Council magazine was you like to listen to music when you're writing as a distraction. But I was surprised, having listened to the music that you suggested, that this would not be distracting, certainly be distracting for the person in the next room, because what you suggested we listen to on YouTube was a song called Mama Lauda, or Wie heißt die Mutter van Niki Lauda. And I was just wondering, what did you get out of that when you were writing?
I can't actually remember how I got into that. It was a couple of years ago now, but I essentially got into German Schlager music while I was writing this. And actually, the reason was, I can't remember now, there was a chapter at the beginning of Black Lake Manor, which was originally set at an underground rave in Berlin in some abandoned nuclear bunker. And so I got into listening to this by way of background, and then it just sort of cycled in the background throughout my writing the book. I'd endlessly listened to this album or these albums. My wife insisted I put my AirPods in because she got so tired of it, but it served as a distraction, which I wasn't really listening to it or the words, but it seems to just free up something in the brain. And sadly,
Go on.
I was going to say, sadly, the opening chapter, which I absolutely loved, my editor hated and said, "I'm not buying a book with a gangster shootout at the beginning." And so instead, you end up with a chess tournament, which was rather more civil and sedate than my original plan. But that led me to listening to Schlager music throughout.
I was wondering, sorry to interrupt you, but I was wondering if you're going to in your novels recommend sort of accompanying music, rather like some restaurants have a tasting menu with accompanying wines. You could, at the beginning of the chapter, suggest what piece of music the listener should turn on? I don't know.
I think people would probably find it quite distracting. I think somebody who hasn't listened to Wie heißt die Mutter von Niki Lauda 50 times, as I have, and is trying to follow what's going on, would probably find it very distracting trying to read at the same time. Whereas I got to a point where I just tuned it out. And I also think music is so personal that it's quite difficult to sort of have a tasting menu of music to go alongside the words.
Yeah, well, I just had this idea that your publishers might like the commercial benefit of selling the CD alongside the novel. Finally, I want to ask you about book festivals. I see that you're appearing at the Farnham Festival, Literary Festival, on the 13th of March 2025, along with BA Paris as well, who's also coming to the Morpeth Book Festival. And I was just wondering how you see the benefit of book festivals, both from the author's point of view, but also from the audience's point of view, and coming to see authors speak.
Well, from my point of view, I, as most other authors, spend 90% of my time sitting in my study, tapping away on a keyboard in my own little world. And it's quite isolating. And you get some feedback by looking at reviews, but I've got to a point where I'm a bit nervous about reading reviews because all you tend to do is focus on the one star or 3-star review rather than the 10 5 stars because you're thinking, what did I get wrong? So you don't get an awful lot of feedback from audiences, and it can also be a bit stark trying to do it that way. Whereas I really like coming to these festivals and meeting people and understanding what it is they liked about the books, what they didn't like. And often people ask me questions I wasn't expecting at all, and bits in the book that I hadn't thought about or seen that someone else has seen and wants to know more about. And I just find it really interesting engaging with people who have read something I've written and I've never met before and see what they got out of it. Because in my experience, people who come to festivals are all, they're very nice, they're very interested, they're normally very engaged. Frequently, we're having to wrap up the Q&As, earlier than we want to because the next person needs to come in. And so from my point of view, I really enjoy that. And I hope from the audience point of view, and I go to festivals, to see other authors as well, and to watch other authors. And I hope it's an interesting way to engage with, the people behind the books that you like. And to meet authors that you wouldn't normally meet. I remember before I started writing, I thought it was an amazing idea to be able to write a book and be an author. And I've slightly lost that wonder because I now see it from the other side. But I think from a reader's point of view, it's just nice to be able to put a face and a personality to something behind the book, because often it's quite difficult to work out who the author is and what they do and what they stand for.
Well, thanks. Well, we look forward to facing you and you facing us and engaging. And thank you very much for giving us your time. And I look forward to seeing you in March.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to it myself.
Bye.
Thank you very much.